Alright guys, last ditch effort here at Decolonization. I will make sure this is on the right YouTube channel. When it comes to decolonization, South America in some ways is similar to Africa. And we're going to start way in the bottom down in Argentina. When we last left South America, Jose de San Martin and Simon Bolivar were leading their different rebellions. And by the early 1900s, for the outbreak of World War I, Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in all of Latin America. It had great industrial and farming landowners. And then, in 1929, the Great Depression hit. A lot of the crops and things that Argentina grew, it was too expensive to export them or import them to foreign countries. So those jobs were quickly lost. And this leads to a military guy, someone to come in and restore order and organization, and this will last for the next 50 years. In 1946, Juan Perón will be elected president. And one of the things he will do is get rid of the colonized multinational corporations that kind of sucked the life, he felt, from the Argentinian people. And he tries to help improve wages and organize labor, and he was assisted by his super popular wife, Eva Perón. However, slowly but surely, he kind of changes and he begins to oppress the opposition, sort of like a Mao Zedong or a Joseph Stalin. And a lot of the educated elite left, very similar to China. And all of a sudden, the government takes over the industry like a communist government, and it crashes. The country just can't handle it. And when Eva dies in 1952, Juan loses a lot of his popularity and is then kicked out of the country. So for the next 20 years, we have different military leaders coming into and out of power. No matter what they try, nothing ever got better. So in the early 1970s, Perón is brought back in to stabilize the situation, but he dies less than a year later. His new wife, Isabel, was the first woman president in Latin America, building on his popularity. However, she was once again overthrown by the military. So a theme in Latin American decolonization is the power of the military. They will go to war on their own citizens, what is so-called the dirty war, as they kill 20,000, it's a miniature French Revolution, of their own people. By 1983, a democracy had come back into power as the Soviet Union was weakening, and by 1990 the Argentinian economy was on its way back. So we've got different military factions going on in Argentina, which brings us to Nicaragua. Oh, Nicaragua. After World War II, Central America was always a tinderbox ready to explode. We've got old world landowning nobles like Spanish guys whose ancestors declared independence from Spain but stayed rich. They also ran the military. A lot of the common people were very poor, and communism was always an attraction to them. So the United States was constantly intervening. From 1936 to 1979, the Somoza family was a small dynasty that ruled Nicaragua. They stayed in power with a lot of U.S. military backing and funding. However, by 1970, different groups began to oppose the family and their leader, Anastasio Somoza. They wanted something different. Rebels who wanted him out were called Sandinistas, and they were a young nationalist group like the Nicaraguan version of the Young Turks who wanted to reform the governmental power. They also wanted more rights for women, and they were young, educated students. These were guys who had learned about different ideas, political ideas, and they wanted their voice heard. In 1979, they will eventually win and elect a guy named Daniel Ortega. Problem was, Ortega was a socialist, almost a communist, and he wanted to redistribute all of the land to the poor people. Worrying about another Fidel Castro situation, President Ronald Reagan funded a group known as the Contras. This starts a civil war where Nicaragua fought throughout the 1980s. The Sandinistas were able to remain in power up to 1990. Democratic elections in 1990 elected Violeta Chamorro, but as a result of the decade-long war, Nicaragua is still trying to recover. So the U.S. backed a dictator who was overthrown by his own people and then tried to unseat the communist one and lost. This is Colonel Oliver North, involved in a thing known as the Iran-Contra affair, because we were sort of backing both sides. Mexico, boy, just a long, tough road here. Mexico in the late 1870s, right after the Mexican-American War, they were ruled by a guy named Porfirio Diaz. And this is another general who comes to power based on his status in the army. And he lives, makes all the promises to the poor. I'm going to help you. I'm going to do this for you. And in the end, he was corrupt. And he always said order and progress, order and progress. But he's able to stay in power almost up to World War I. And his most outspoken opponent was from a very old aristocratic family, Francisco Madero, who was a young man, studied in the United States, and ran for president, but because he almost won, was exiled. It's at this time that Mexican revolutionaries like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata are going to lead armies against Diaz. It is a peasant uprising against their leader. So there's Pancho Villa, there is Zapata, and there is Diaz. Both leaders supported Madero, who was exiled, and campaigned for the poor. Well, Madero is brought back from exile, and he's quickly assassinated, which gives way to another general, General Huerta, who is very unpopular with Zapata, one of the peasant leaders, and Villa, who has him replaced. So we've just got a constant change of leaders going on in Mexico. By 1914, Venancio Carranza takes control. A lot of different names, just keep track of the theme here. Unleashes his army on Zapata and Villa. I'm going to use the army to get rid of my peasant leader opponents. Think of Zapata and Villa like Giuseppe Garibaldi and Mazzini in Italy. And a new constitution is written that's going to do three things. Number one, break up large landed estates, then give them to the people. That it is Mexico and Mexico alone that should control Mexico's resources, not foreign governments, and limit foreign control and business inside Mexico. All of this will be done within the confines of the United States Monroe Doctrine that says, look, what happens over here is an American sphere of influence. And so the United States will back different leaders who will look after our own interests. In 1932, President Roosevelt will institute what is known as the Good Neighbor Policy, where we agree not to intervene in Mexico and Latin America problems, and we bring our troops home from Nicaragua and Haiti. All is good until World War II ends, when the United States is forced to intervene once again. In 1929, there is the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PIR, which will dominate Mexico for decades. Everybody from business leaders to farmers and military men are going to work together. They're going to improve health care. We're going to increase education for our people, and we are all going to keep it internal and do it ourselves. One of the things that President Roosevelt had to repair is the army was sent in, Woodrow Wilson sent in our army to capture Pancho Villa, and then there was a bold move by the Soviet Union to get Mexico to invade, from Germany to get Mexico to invade in World War I. So, this brings us back to the 1980s, where Japan and the United States were looking for cheaper labor to manufacture large industrial products like cars and electronics. This sponsored the creation of NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, that lowered trade barriers between Canada, the United States, and Mexico to open up a European market. Unfortunately for Mexico, this did not work out, as they could not compete economically and with products from Canada and the United States, and became a source of cheap labor. So in the United States, we have massive layoffs and no workers' rights. Corporate America gets rich, and workers abroad get slave wages. This brings us to the poor island nation of Haiti. From 1957 to 1971, we have Dr. Francois Duvalier, known as Papa Doc. He is like a mini Joseph Stalin. His secret police will eliminate all opposition against him. He will be succeeded by his son, Jean-Claude, known as Baby Doc, who is maybe even more brutal and thuggish than his dad, who will run the country into the ground. You can see the poor, people right here. It's so bad that we get a young priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who says, yes, that Haitians will be dignified living in poverty. We can just take it. Things are so bad, the United States takes over, as human rights groups were watching. The U.S. and UN militaries, the UNICRAT, had to intervene to stop the killings and massacring in the poor country of Haiti. Aristide was exiled, but he returns for 10 years till 2004. And while they were working at getting better, Haiti was ravaged by a massive earthquake. And try as they might, they're still trying to recover. And in the early 60s or 50s, there was the Organization of American States, a group of Latin American countries that were created to promote democracy and prevent communism, that loaned millions for education and land reform. However, there's still many problems in Latin America. They are still recovering to this day. Wealthy countries like Venezuela and Brazil, who have oil and diverse economies, use their resources to break away from things that plague their other Latin American neighbors. Also, at this time, imperialization and decolonization take effect in India and Pakistan. We know, going back to the 1800s with the British intervention, many groups wanted foreigners out. So Muhammad al-Jinnah wants a separate Islamic state, and he is the head of what is known as the Arab League. After World War II, England emerges and agrees to Indian independence. They are going to let India go. However, riots break out to convince England that they have to divide the subcontinent between Hindus and Muslims. It was nearly impossible to draw fair borders. Muslims and Hindus had lived side by side for generations. Now all of a sudden they're forced into two separate countries, India for Hindus and Pakistan for Muslims. So in 1947, people began to be forcibly moved to cross all these different borders And centuries of mistrust over religious mistrust and the British erupts into violence. And 10 million people are forced to flee from their homes in all the violence. This is when great peaceful nationalist leader Mahatma Gandhi preaches peace and tolerance. And his assassination causes people on both sides to stop. Everybody knew he was an honorable and a good guy, and it discredits the violence between India and Pakistan. In the Middle East, close by, speaking of the Gandhi's daughter and grandson were also assassinated. That is the great quote from Prime Minister Nehru, who will say, with Gandhi, a great light has gone out in the world, and India and Pakistan are still squabbling. In the Middle East, we have something known as OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting States. And in the 1970s, they begin to use oil as a weapon. They realized that oil is the lifeblood of industry, and that the Western-owned banks and technology dominated their region. And so they realized that small, sparsely populated countries had a lot of oil and got rich, while large, heavily populated countries has none. And the West dominated and drew up specific boundaries just to make money, making many people angry. A good example of this is Iraq, where England put 4 different groups who can't stand each other into one single country. And we saw how that turned out. The blue countries, Ecuador, Venezuela, Algeria, Nigeria, and Angola, Libya, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates are members of OPEC. When I was a young boy, they began to raise the price of gasoline. They can manipulate it based on the number of barrels of oil they produce, causing long lines, gas lines. It got so bad that things had to be regulated. Even-numbered license plates could get gas Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Odd-numbered license plates were Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. It backfires on OPEC, and but they learned that they do have power and a voice with manipulation of oil. In Iran, here's another decolonization in the Middle East. We have the Shah of Iran, a United States-backed leader, a spoiled rich kid who the United States backed. England and the USSR also wanted into Iran because it had a massive oil field that was found in 1970. When the Shah left for a cancer treatment to the Cleveland Clinic, the guy on the right, the Ayatollah Khomeini, led a fundamentalist takeover, capturing the American embassy and capturing 127 hostages for 444 days by claiming the Shah did not follow Islam and Sharia law, so he must be thrown over. In Iran, he wanted to export the Islamic revolution. And this will turn into other things. Problems is genocide across the world, where it's an attempt to destroy an entire religious or ethnic group. Sometimes it's Armenian Christians being killed by Turkish Muslims, and back and forth. We know about the Jewish Holocaust in World War II. In Rwanda, the small minority Tutsis were killed by the Hutu majority, and by 1994, 1 million Tutsis had been killed in Rwanda. This, some of you may have done in your English projects, the Sudan or Darfur, where in Africa we've got the Sudanese Liberation Army was protesting the treatment of the poor people. The government's response was to leave a group of guys known as Janjaweeds, or devils on horses. They are an Arabic militia, mobilized cavalry. They will come in and kill nearly 500,000 people, 400,000 and displacing 2,500,000. And the problems in Sudan and Darfur are still ongoing to this very day. In the middle of all this decolonization, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union. When Joseph Stalin will die in 1953, his next in line, his buddy Nikita Khrushchev, takes over. And as soon as Stalin died, Khrushchev began to criticize Stalin's abuse of power. And he begins a long process known as de-Stalinization. However, if you look at the Khrushchev regime and the Stalin regime, there's not too many differences. Khrushchev was dedicated to maintaining the Iron Curtain, and when food ran out, the Soviets got it first, and they didn't get much, and Eastern Europe got what was left over. When the starving people began to rebel against communist rule, he does what they always do, is send in tanks and soldiers to calm the crisis. In 1964, right after the Bay of Pigs invasion, we get a new Soviet leader known as Leonid Brezhnev. He will stay in power until the 1980s. And he's like an old Stalinist. He will quickly clamp down on any dissension of anybody speaking out against him in his country. And so Khrushchev and Brezhnev will spend a lot of the country's monetary resources on science and technology, trying to outdo the United States. They get a brief glimmer of hope in 1957 when Sputnik becomes the first man-made craft to orbit the Earth. That only kicks the Cold War into high gear. And so using this victory, Khrushchev and Brezhnev touted the Soviet system of a free health care where no one is left out, everyone is employed, and things are just Jim Dandy and awesome. But are they? Neither leader was able to solve the fundamental problems of communism inside the Soviet economy. It produced results in quick little bursts or pulses or sprints, only in the short term. There was a state-planned economy known as the Gauss Plan, where people sat in a room and they used some formula to project output. And the farmer had to produce what the state said. Well, this state-planned economy never allows the farmers to grow enough food to feed everybody. So the Soviets often had to purchase grain from outside countries like the United States or wherever, China, to feed their own citizens. Western economies not only had enough food, but plentiful products for consumers to buy. The Cold War, the invention of the television, washing machines, dryers, refrigerators, cars, you name it, Western countries had it. Soviet products often broke down and they were just cheap. And Soviets had to wait in line to get basic necessities like food. Many did not have their own cars, and the waiting lists were 10 or 15 years long. The central planning group was removed from the people on the factory floors. Apparently Bob doesn't know how to run the factory. And so people were deciding what was going to be produced, how much of it, and how long it would take. Problem is, Bob has no idea of where they're going to get the supply of raw materials, or how we can increase the output of goods, or how we run the entire factory. So we removed the State Planning Commission, we gave it to Bob. Bob can put lug nuts on a tire, but he can't do much else. The problem with this is the Central Planning Group, they were guaranteed a job for life. All they did was project the output, and it was somebody else's idea to figure out the other intangibles. So Soviet workers would come to work and there was no raw materials. Remember, going back to a strong central authority, they're highly organized, they've got a knowledge of complex mathematics. Well, They didn't understand mathematics and they weren't organized. And there was no incentive. Why work harder or longer? There's no incentive. One of you gets 100, the other one of you gets a 75. I split the points and you both wind up with an 85. Why bust your butt and get 100? This is how the Soviet economy will run forever. So during the Cold War, Brezhnev will institute his own doctrine that said the Soviets can intervene in any Warsaw Pact country that steps out of line. It's Clemens von Metternich and the Congress of Vienna. If there's a threat to your country, invade your neighbors. Many people in Eastern Europe did not like this domination. The country of Hungary in 1856 is the first to try and gain independence when Prime Minister Nagy told the Soviets they had to get out. They were no longer welcome. The response was the Soviets immediately sent in troops and put down the independence movement, and Nagy and many Hungarian political leaders were executed. Here's tanks rolling in, blowing up and running you over in the middle of the street, whether you like it or not. As soon as the problem of Hungary dies down, Poland picks up. Poland had always been treated harshly by the Soviet Union. They invaded on September 1st, 1939, and what the Soviets hated was the Roman Catholic Church, which was extremely powerful inside Poland. Now, Poland had been suffering a lot economically at the hands of the Soviet Union, and when things don't get better, many Polish workers begin to strike. In 1978, a cardinal who had thwarted the communists several times, Karol Wojtyła, was elected as Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, the first non-Italian Pope in 500 years. He becomes known as John Paul II, and he began to support and promote anti-communist feelings throughout Eastern Europe. This inspires a dock worker, Lech Walesa, who organized a movement on the Warsaw docks known as Solidarity. The Soviet Union will react quickly, and the leadership of the movement, nearly 8 million people, including there are 8 million people in the movement, but they were being led by Walesa and several prominent political leaders who were all immediately arrested. There's Pope John Paul and Lech Walesa saying, solidarity. It was Walesa's arrest, and Pope John Paul comes to speak in Warsaw. And he speaks about the ill of communism and brings international attention to how bad things were. And so at different periods during the Cold War, there were times when both sides called for an easing of tension between them. This will become known as détente, and it's centered around nuclear disarmament, as both countries had enough nuclear weapons to blow up the world many times. Things were starting to gain traction when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. This attack was one more weight on the scale of financial problems that the Soviet Union could not handle. And so it brings an end of détente. And then in 1985, one of the greatest years of all time, a young new political leader, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, becomes this guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. And he saw things a little different than his older, hardline, old-school communist predecessors, and he wants to fix the Soviet Union's backwards, inefficient economy. So this is Afghanistan, just carnage. These are the troops rolling over the border. And Gorbachev says we've got to end the Cold War that's sapping our economy. So he scraps the Brezhnev Doctrine, and he begins to negotiate with the United States and pulls Soviet troops out of Afghanistan. And he says that he would not any longer interfere with Eastern European reform or independence movements. And so in 1989, the Solidarity movement becomes legal in Poland. Walesa is released and elected the first president of a democratic Poland. This was the first time since Adolf Hitler invaded 50 years before that Poland was a free country. Gorbachev will institute two additional political things known as glasnost, which is openness, and perestroika, which means overhaul of the government and economy. He begins to allow some capitalist free market policies and said its factory managers, knowledgeable people at the local level, should have a larger say in how their factory runs. Unfortunately, economic turmoil ensues. It was too much change at one time. It was like a quick day and night, and no one really went through the slow steps of change, and so it got to be chaotic. And while Gorbachev's intentions were good, the people were not prepared or ready. And so by 1991, old Soviet republics want to rebel, and things aren't getting better. People were talking about going back to communism. So Gorbachev is removed from office and replaced by the mayor of Moscow, Boris Yeltsin. So it is Yeltsin who will see the breakup of the old school Soviet Union, making Russia a modern democratic republic. But still, some people want to go back to old school communism. So the gray countries were once the Eastern Bloc. The red is still part of Russia. There are many ethnic and religious minorities who wanted to become independent, like Chechnya, small regions, and they begin to rebel, and many Warsaw Pact countries all of a sudden want to switch sides and join NATO. This strains Russia's patience and resources. And so while democracy is still trying to go inside Russia, it's very difficult with Vladimir Putin running the show. The Soviet Union, a once dominant world power, is seeing its influence dwindle. It's trying to resurge, so we've got to keep our eye on them. And this was the great night of November 9th, 1989, as the Berlin Wall, one of the strongest symbols of the Cold War, separating East and West Berlin, comes down. And it was this visible symbol, this complete happiness and euphoria, no violence, no anger, just people just palpably happy, that symbolizes the breakup of the Soviet Union. As a result, Czechoslovakia will split from one country into two. Yugoslavia will split into 7 different countries, resulting in different ethnic and religious groups trying to cleanse or commit genocide on one another. Boris Yeltsin will not allow Chechnya to become independent, and so there's fighting going on in the region today, plus all of their nuclear weapons that were sold on the black market. In 1999, former KGB FSB agent Vladimir Putin was asked to take over the reins of Russia. He was an old communist with a new democratic title who wrote the Constitution so he can stay in power. He tried to reclaim the Ukraine in 2014, and he is seen by many as an old school communist leader. All right, guys, that's pretty quick. Hope you enjoyed that, and I will upload it to the right place and people will actually watch it.